Welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldy. I'll serve as the host for our talk today. As I think many, if not all of you know, we're running this in a hybrid format so that we will be able to share our discussion today with those who are joining us on Zoom. If you are not on the email list for the Energy Policy Seminar, please send me an email. We'll get you on the list. I can be reached at joseph_aldy at hks.harvard.edu. If you're here in person, I understand there's a QR code on the posting of the seminar just outside the door. So you can just click on that to sign up for our email list. We're excited to welcome back to the Harvard Kennedy School Professor Michael Davidson for his talk, Decoupling from China in Clean Tech, Risk and Rewards. Professor Davidson is an assistant professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and the Jacobs School of Engineering at the University of California, San Diego. His research focuses on the engineering implications and institutional conflicts inherent in deploying renewable energy at scale. He's particularly interested in systems within emerging electricity markets, including China and India, as well as the Western United States. Prior to joining UCSD, Davidson was a postdoctoral fellow here at the Belfer Center's Environment and Natural Resources Program. He previously served as the U.S.-China Climate Policy Coordinator for NRDC. He is a Public Intellectuals Program Fellow at the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations and a former Fulbright Scholar. He earned his PhD in Engineering Systems at the MIT Institute for Data, Systems, and Society. Mike, welcome to the seminar.
Thanks, Joe. And it's great to be back with you all in a very new room, so I got a little lost on the way here. So I'm very excited to show you my talk once the slides show up. Oh, there we go. It was waiting on me, as always. Well, it's delightful to be with you here to talk about an emerging topic in climate policy and energy policy, which I think is quite important for us to think about as we are trying to embark on a very rapid energy transition, particularly thinking about decoupling from China. By way of introduction, Joe already generously talked about it, but just a little bit about what we do at our lab. We're thinking about engineering problems. We're also thinking about institutional problems. So this largely pulls from two different methodological domains. One is thinking about low carbon infrastructure planning, and another is thinking about institutions in energy and how we need to change incumbent institutions and interactions that they play with planning for low carbon systems. So this involves working with engineering economic models like optimization for electricity, renewable resource assessments, as well as the technology learning curves that we're going to be talking about today. In addition, we incorporate some political economy analyses into these models and use other methodologies as appropriate, thinking about market transitions. Again, this is a big focus in China and India. And then geopolitical barriers to low carbon transitions, how those affect the ability for countries such as the US to embark on a very rapid transition. And then because China and India have quite a bit of state-owned enterprises, I think a lot about state-linked firms and their role in the climate space. All right, so decarbonization. We all know we need to get to net zero roughly by mid-century. These are 1.5 degree emissions pathways, a variety of pathways as you see from the IPCC. In addition, because CO2 is a stock pollutant, cumulative emissions also matter. So you'll see if we wait a little bit too long, out here we overshoot, then we have to do a lot more negative emissions in the latter half of the century. And regardless, we're going to need most likely a lot of negative emissions technologies. And so those are not commercially available today. And we need to develop those and deploy those at scale. So there's a central tension here in the clean tech sector because it's so crucial to the climate change problem. We need to increase the supply of clean energy dramatically everywhere, not just in the US, but in a lot of other countries where there is a legitimate cost trade-off between low carbon energies and fossil energies like coal. And we need to do that through continued cost declines in already mature technologies, but also developing the next generation of low carbon technology, commercializing them. And we know that technology cost declines historically for solar, wind, and batteries are largely because of the globalization and production innovation enhancements in supply chains. So globalization has been a key contributor, if not the key contributor, to cost declines in these other technologies. But there's also at the same time a growing policy efforts in the US and in Europe and many other places to decouple from these globalized supply chains, i.e. China, for a variety of reasons. One is the sector is becoming so much more important economically. There are geopolitical tensions. There are calls about enhancing supply chain security and a variety of other reasons. So this is what we're going to be talking about today, is this sort of central tension between where we need to go and what is the current policy discourse. So I'm going to talk about two papers today. One just came out in Science a few weeks ago, where we, along with my co-authors, Valerie Karplus, Joanna Lewis, Jonas Nam, and Alex Wong, talk about a framework for decoupling from China, thinking about decoupling from China. Just to set the scene, this is just a few months after the Biden administration came into office. There's a variety of very high-profile statements and documents around decoupling from China with a focus on clean tech. So in the national security guidance, there's a focus on prevailing in strategic competition with China, working with like-minded nations to advance clean energy goals, building resilient, diverse, secure supply chains to counter China's ambitions in technology. And then there's a separate executive order that looked across various supply chains and noting that US dependency on China for minerals in battery and vehicle could affect military preparedness. And this has been accompanied by increasing numbers of policies to advance this decoupling agenda. On supply chains and trade, there are import tariffs and import quotas on solar and wind technologies, not just from China, but from other countries as well. There's been restrictions on technology development, using entities list by the Commerce Department to restrict interactions, not just with Chinese firms, but with universities. Advancing calls for creating technology partnerships that are limited to democracies, and then increasing interaction or stifling of scientific engagement through a variety of programs, such as the China Initiative through the DOJ, which was recently nominally disbanded, but the basic tenors still remain. More rigorous visa application reviews and a general research security emphasis that scrutinizes foreign collaborations and collaborations with China in particular. So the question that we pose is, how should the US weigh the benefits of integration against these risks? And the methodology we chose was to, rather than focus at this at a very high level, take 5 specific technologies, 3 mature, 2 emerging, and focus in particular on the economic and national security risks of integration. There are many other concerns that policymakers will consider, such as human rights and labor standards, environment issues, et cetera. We choose to focus on economic and national security risks. And then we draw case examples for each of these technologies, focusing on drawing from quantitative indicators like dependence, as well as subjective assessments in terms of the risks faced by these different technologies. And then we aggregate those from the component level up to the technology level in order to make conclusions about different policy recourse strategies. All right, so diving in a little bit into the economic and national security risks, when we looked at the literature and broadly what policymakers are discussing, we identified basically 3 types of economic risks that come up quite frequently. The first is a concern around job losses domestically. And when we think about that, we're looking at where are the jobs coming from across the whole value chain of these technologies. So manufacturing is one, and certainly the most prominent politically, but there's also installation and project development, which frequently have more jobs involved in them. Automation is a key component of becoming efficient and competitive. That also reduces, of course, the job benefits of having manufacturing these technologies. And then also we consider quantity and quality of these jobs. In terms of intellectual property, we think not only about the narrow issue of IPR theft, which has come up only in a handful of instances, but more broadly about trade-offs that firms make when they do IP licensing agreements. So basically exchanging markets for technology, as well as more broadly forced technology transfer, which is not technically an IPR violation, but is a violation of trade law. And then finally, supply chain disruptions, which comes up quite frequently, not just in clean tech, of course, across the whole economy right now. And we think about this in terms of the vulnerability to specific events. So that's natural disasters as well as government intervention, like an embargo. And what is the ability for firms to resume operations or seek alternative sourcing arrangement in the event of a disruption? All right. Now, in terms of the national security risks, we identified three kind of largely most frequently cited concerns with integration with China. The first is critical infrastructure. So all of these or most of these technologies are being integrated into the power grid, which is recognized as a critical infrastructure. So key to the key to broader economic activity outside of that sector. And for this, we'd be mostly thinking about what would be the potential for, say, Chinese manufactured equipment to disrupt electricity networks in the US through, for example, backdoors. Dual use. So these are technologies that have both military and commercial applications. And then energy security. And energy security is a little bit different than the others because traditionally energy security is framed in terms of the ability to provide sufficient supply to meet consumer demand. And it's usually a very short run problem. In the case of low carbon technologies, if China stops selling us solar panels, for example, the lights don't go out tomorrow. That's a long-term disruption. So we incorporate that into supply chain disruptions. And so we won't actually talk about energy security for the remainder of the talk here. So here's the kind of high level result table when we looked across these 5 technologies and these 5 risks. We find that in general, national security risks are quite muted, right? The critical infrastructure risks appear to be very manageable, and dual use applications are quite minor across the various technologies. There's some exceptions with, for example, high performance batteries, and there's more critical infrastructure concerns potentially with wind turbine systems, which have a more sophisticated software. But largely speaking, very low and homogeneous. Economic risks are more diverse. So we see certainly high potential or high risk of supply chain disruptions in solar PV and batteries, because in these 2 sectors, China has a dominant supply chain or dominant roles in the supply chain. Across the other systems, we have a much more international integration in the current components. Now, of course, the emerging technologies are still emerging in development, but the technologies upon which green steel and CCS could be built are currently much more diverse and don't suffer from these supply chain disruptions. And then when we look across the other risks, again, they're low to medium, but they do differ by the specific technologies. So in solar PV and batteries, much less a concern around IPR violations at the moment, potentially in wind turbines and these more advanced technologies, we could see some potential, but again, more muted. This, as I said, was drawn from a component level analysis for each of those 5 technologies. So this is just the batteries example to give you a sense of why we scored batteries high on supply chain disruptions and medium on dual use. The key component here for batteries is the refining capacity, and then the productions of cells, which are highly concentrated in China. And similarly for national security risks, if we had a complete stop in Chinese refining of minerals that are necessary for batteries, that could present a national security risk for example, providing batteries for military applications. That's why we code that as medium. But upstream mining is less concentrated and depends on the particular mineral. And then the final assembly and pack is less concentrated. So this is just an example. We have the other 4 technologies where we code them at the component level or different technology pathway levels. In the case of CCS and green steel, where there are a lot of competing technologies currently under development. So I would be remiss if I didn't look at the agenda for the energy policy seminar for the rest of the fall. And it feels like you're going to get a whole 3 months about the Inflation Reduction Act. So here's my slide on the IRA. Overwhelmingly good is the good, bad, the ugly, like my take on it in the context of this talk. Overwhelmingly good. We have in the act stable long-term credits for clean energy, and as well as CCS. We have some consumer-facing rebates on energy-efficient appliances like heat pumps, yay. Manufacturing subsidies, so again, direct support for manufacturers, and a lot of other really good things. What might be the bad? Well, it doesn't really touch any of the existing trade restrictions that are currently in place, and what is really the focus of a lot of the decoupling efforts that we're talking about here. And then potentially ugly is these very restrictive local content requirements on battery sourcing for EVs. So to qualify for electric vehicle credit, you have to have a very high percentage, not only of the batteries manufactured, but the minerals that went into the batteries manufactured. And they have various complicated requirements, whether it needs to be done in North America or with like-minded countries with which the US has a free trade agreement, et cetera, et cetera. Essentially all in one sentence, can't come from China, right? And this is very difficult to assess how many EVs are actually going to qualify for this at the moment. Just as an example, I had a student who was looking to buy an electric vehicle, and he looked at the Chevrolet Bolt, and currently it's already met the cap, so it can't qualify. But maybe in January, it could qualify for the IRA, but it's still very unclear if the batteries that go into the Bolt would satisfy these mineral sourcing requirements. And effectively, we don't really know at this moment what EVs are going to qualify, and it will be very challenging to meet these content requirements as they ramp up. So this is an area of uncertainty. We don't quite know where it's going to go, but it could potentially be that a lot of EVs wouldn't qualify for those credits. All right, so then once we have assigned these risks, what do we do with that information? Well, we came up with a policy recourse strategy that depends on our assessment of the economic risks as well as the national security risks. And the idea being that we have basically 3 options before us. We can either embrace open supply chains or open RD&D arrangements, or on the other end, we could require domestic everything, onshore it, and restrict foreign participation. And in the middle, we could have a policy of encouraging diversification. So it doesn't have to be here in this country, but it could be with a handful of other countries such that no country has a dominant share, for example. And when we map these technologies onto this landscape, we see here's solar PV and batteries, again, the ones that have the highest concentration in China and the highest potential risk for supply chain disruptions. In these circumstances, it makes sense to try to diversify supply chains from that argument alone. On the other hand, on these other supply chains where we see much lower economic risks, we might be happy with open supply chains. Now, when we incorporate the national security dimensions to this, there are additional reasons why we may want to have diversified supply chains. And so that's why we see here on the wind technologies, maybe because of those national security risks, we want to have more diversification in those technologies. And at the very extreme end, which none of the clean technologies qualify under our assessment, would be we want to have domestic supply chains and domestic RD&D. Well, basically what we're coming up with here is that we find that for most of these technologies, having diversification strategies where necessary seems to be sufficient. And in many cases, we want to maintain open relationships, both for RD&D as well as supply chain, to take advantage of those amazing cost declines that we've seen in these technologies to date. All right, so just a sort of a quick wrap up on what we found out with this analysis. One is that there is generic benefits of decoupling, but there are specific costs associated generic benefits of diversification, but specific costs of decoupling, and that depends on the technology and the time frame. National security risks are manageable, and government facilitation may be desirable to enhance cooperative arrangements, RD&D, particularly on newer technologies related to industrial decarbonization and CCS. And then also to encourage diversification and R&D if necessary along geographic as well as technological dimensions. Also, we note that there are some unintended consequences of poorly designed policies. Just as an example, the US put in place tariffs on China's solar panels under the Obama administration. China responded with retaliatory tariffs on our polysilicon industry, which at the time was actually a significant share of global production. And as a result, our polysilicon industry fell off. And now polysilicon is largely produced within China in the very contested province of Xinjiang, where we see these issues. So policy responses and trade can have unintended consequences that may not manifest for years down the road. Okay, so that was the high level picture of the assessment of risks of integration. I want to talk to you about a second paper, which is coming out in Nature in a few weeks here, where we focus on one specific supply chain, solar, and look at what were the benefits to the cost reductions in solar as a result of globalized supply chains. So we probably all are very familiar with the story, right? That solar costs have declined dramatically. We see 80+% declines in the CapEx, 85, 90% declines in LCOE. These are global numbers. Each country is a bit different, but largely we see these dramatic declines. And these are actually replicated across wind and batteries as well. And this, of course, coincides with China taking over a larger and larger share of production. This is cell production by origin in all of these various origins, and we see China's production has dramatically increased over this period. So the typical way that we think about cost declines in technology innovation literature is we use a learning curve model. So a learning curve model basically says that we have some quantity of deployment, Q, and then that's related to the price of that through this log-log relationship. The idea being that we learn by doing, we learn by researching, we learn by doing lots of other things associated with building and deploying technologies, and the more we deploy it cumulatively, the lower the price comes. This is also related to a learning rate where we extract the coefficient related to the quantity in this L here. For this, we also do what we call a two-factor learning model. So we also incorporate the global price of polysilicon as a potential additional driver of price declines. And when we're doing this over the period of study noted here, I plot this on the polysilicon price graph just so you can see how much variation there was over polysilicon, and also potentially a little bit about unintended consequences of policy. At this point, right when polysilicon was starting to spike, a lot of non-silicon technologies looked pretty good, including Cylindra, for example. And then shortly thereafter, the silicon price plummeted, and that now we have monocrystalline silicon and increasingly multicrystalline silicon being the dominant technology in solar panels because the silicon has been stubbornly cheap. These are the results of just using that simple learning model. So we find that it's highly significant if you just look at cumulative capacity in each of these countries, corresponding to learning rates from 20 to 30%. We're looking at the three biggest and most interesting solar deploying countries in the world, United States, China, and Germany for this analysis. And these percentages largely track what we see in the literature from other folks that have used learning models and more sophisticated learning models. But we wanted to do a little bit more. We wanted to think about, okay, well, what would happen if countries enact very strict nationalist policies that restrict the free flow of solar goods, intermediate goods, as well as final goods? They restrict cross-national research and development. And they also put up barriers to cross-border investment. So this allows us to construct a national markets counterfactual. And what is this? Well, we basically say that the amount of capacity that's contributing to the learning benefits that we saw before is now a function of a few parameters. One is, what is the cumulative installed capacity in the country itself, not globally. And then what is happening in the rest of the world. And then we adjust that with this parameter lambda, so that when lambda equals 0, these two add up to being the total global cumulative production. So that's our historical baseline model, what I just showed you. And then when lambda equals 1, this term goes away, and you're just left with domestic cumulative deployment. And so then we set up a national market scenario where we start with 0, so global markets, and then over a 10-year period, we gradually enforce national markets. So we make that go to 1 over this 10-year period. And what would happen historically over that period, the same period I just showed you before, if countries had embraced a more national approach to deployment? Well, we see here the historical and global is in blue here. So historical is tracking the global learning curves. And the national deployment, we see the price per kilowatt of solar modules begins to level off towards the end of that period, because increasingly you're learning just from deployment that you're making in your own country, not from the global deployment. And we run some simulations to get the uncertainty bands on these. Then we can look back as well. What are the cost savings associated with having that lower module price over that historical period? Well, we add them up. In each year, we multiply the installed capacity in that year times the module price difference between global and national markets. And we see here for each of the year, what's the annual savings in billions of dollars. And then we look at the cumulative savings. And so we're looking at in the US, around $24 billion of cumulative savings over that decade plus of global markets versus national markets, with some uncertainty bands, as I noted before. Germany has a lower share of this cumulative savings because they kind of bought in really early, right? And they helped to bring down the cost through the global market. So they bought somewhat at higher solar module prices. And then China benefits, of course, because it was developing this capacity to deploy, to manufacture solar PV, actually before it was deploying it at scale in its own country. We're also interested in looking at where this goes from here. So we established some future projections, and we basically looked at two potential 2030 realities. One is sort of what's following national trends in each of these three countries. So the US by 2030, maybe 300 gigawatts of solar, China maybe 750, et cetera. And then we also look at what would be a sustainable development scenario. So here we take the IEA, World Energy Outlook, how much capacity should be deployed in each of those countries in order to achieve those objectives. And then we look at where would the price per kilowatt of the solar modules be in each of those countries under the national trends and the sustainable development. So national trends here in orange, and sustainable development here in blue. And we find that the module prices would be anywhere from 20 to 25% cheaper under a global market scenario compared to a national market scenario starting in 2020. We also did some robustness checks on our learning curve model. This is the reference model coefficients just on those learning rates as a function of that cumulative capacity. We also consider cumulative national production, which was not significant. When we add national installed capacity, doesn't change the results too much. We also considered some plant size, global average plant size, and that was also not significant. So what are some limitations of this study? Well, first and foremost, we ignore price elasticity of demand. So as solar module prices go up, all else being equal, you'd expect consumers to deploy less. We don't incorporate that here. That would tend to actually enhance the effects of a national market scenario. But here we're assuming that deployment is actually driven more by policy. And in fact, it was not statistically significant when we tried to estimate elasticities of price of deployment in the US based on module over this period. It's also, even over a 10-year period, potentially infeasible to generate an entirely solar domestic solar supply chain. You would have to take on some very draconian measures. Nevertheless, we still see policymakers discussing creating an entirely domestic supply chain from minerals all the way to panels. Some other considerations. There is in the innovation literature this idea of maybe this benefit that China gave to the world actually crowded out some other technologies like thin film. So this would be an alternative to a silicon-based panel that could have, if it weren't crowded out by very low-cost Chinese solar, have flourished and maybe gone down in price. There are, of course, considerations, as we talked about in the first paper, around just diversifying supply chains for the benefits of diversification. And then, of course, there are other considerations around environmental health and labor standards in the production itself. So what are the lessons that we draw for policymakers based on this work? So first, I'm going to draw you to what is quickly becoming the reference cost evolution projection database for clean technology being used by models underlying a lot of the analysis around the IRA, for example, and many other analyses for the US. This is the NREL Annual Technology Baseline. So this is components of the capital cost of solar PV in present day. The green part here is module. So this is what the focus of our learning curve study was on. And then they come up with 3 scenarios out to 2030, conservative, moderate, and advanced. And so you can see here how the module prices are assumed to fall pretty dramatically under the moderate and advanced scenario. So this would be their baseline scenario. If I were to go back to our projection curve, this model, these prices could almost be achieved under a global market scenario. National market scenario, it would be impossible to get those levels of module pricing. Now, I show this graph because there also are other cost components that are going to drive down the price of solar. So that include balance of systems costs, this kind of dark blue. So these are elements which don't have as clear learning models associated with them. Germany does a lot better job at bringing down the balance of systems costs than the United States does, even though we've deployed quite a bit of solar. And there are other components as well, but modules are still going to be a key part of the expected cost decline under these 2030 projections. Another point just on the labor component, we spend quite a bit of time thinking about where the labor intensity and where prospective jobs are coming from in the solar supply chain. So this is an estimate done by NREL, just looking across on a per gigawatt basis, where you get, how many jobs you get from polysilicon, refining, purification, the wafer, cells, modules, etc. This is development, installation, and maintenance. So if your top line figure was, I want to increase the number of jobs in the solar industry, the way to do that is to deploy as much solar as possible, because 90% of these jobs can't be outsourced. But that's not to say that these aren't important politically, right? I want to point you to just a few more pieces of work that may be interesting to folks interested in this. UCSD, we had a climate and trade task force that we looked at chapters on adaptation, BCAs, agriculture, fisheries, and clean tech, and thinking about what's the role of trade in these climate change debates. This came out last November, just prior to the COP. And then the clean tech chapter, we talk about some lessons for trade as a result of trying to meet the climate goal. One is that trade measures in well-established global supply chains on the end-use products have had a very poor track record. They tend to either result in trade diversion, and they do not tend to, or just reduction in local demand, or increases in costs for consumers, and have not had a very good track record in enhancing domestic manufacturing of these technologies. By contrast, direct incentives for manufacturing have shown to be more effective. This is how China was able to build up its solar supply chain, for example, among other tools. And then above all else, long-term policy certainty is crucial to establish long-standing solar supply chain sourcing decisions in solar or in other clean tech sectors. So what are some ways forward that manage all of these different competing objectives? First is recognizing that clean energy successes have depended on free flows of innovations. So this is trade and licensing as well as equipment sales, free flows of capital. So cross-border investment and stock listings have been crucial to the development of China's solar industry, for example, as well as talent. So people through international education and collaboration, foreign returnees, and other forms of talent flows. And it seems clear that the continued success in the clean tech sector is going to be reliant on continued learning and the free flows of these technologies as well. Free flows of innovations, capital, and talent. So one potential objective in the US policy towards China on clean tech could be to establish bounds of fair competition and thinking about ways of discussing coexistence with China. This was from a piece by Jessica Chen Weiss in Foreign Affairs very recently. And what are the means with which to achieve this? Well, one approach or one idea that was put forward by Susan Thornton, who's at Yale now, was to gain the needed leverage on China to achieve the kinds of changes we would like to see in terms of these tech sectors and supply chain, would be we need to give China the prospect of a beneficial outcome at the end of it. And trade talks were actually a way to motivate China to come to the table. So some closing observations. One is there are a handful of key policy challenges that are going to face the US and other countries when they try to implement and strengthen climate policy. The first is managing these very crucial political economy trade-offs. One is you have, of course, the public good. You want to reduce emissions as rapidly as possible. And the second is you also have to provide distributed private benefits in order to pass legislation, enhance it, and implement it over time. Two is that standing up national manufacturing is now a key policy agenda everywhere on clean tech, on climate-related sectors. The challenge is how do you do that while preserving all the benefits of global learning? Okay. And we laid out some ideas here. This is going to be a key policy challenge facing the US, Europe, and other places. And for the US, China in particular, minimizing the material harms of tariffs and bilateral tensions seems to me the most important thing that our two countries should be doing right now in order to limit their effects on emissions reduction efforts that are happening, not just in the US, but around the world that depend on low carbon technologies in order to achieve our climate goals. So with that, I'll stop here and invite questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Michael. Alex Clark from Oxford University. I've got a couple of questions. It seems that particularly for solar, the sort of blinking red light is supply chain risks and supply chain disruptions. The question being if China is not the point at which some of the critical materials are processed or where throughput is taking place and modules are getting manufactured and shipped, where else might this be happening? And there are obvious free trade partners in Latin America and elsewhere, potentially in Europe, that the US could work with. But in a lot of cases, the missing link there is actually investment from US corporates or Canadian corporates, for example, because the financial institutions backing them are concerned about the ESG risks and all sorts of other factors, which is allowing Chinese companies to offer credit or investment on more attractive terms. So I wonder what your thoughts would be on that. And secondly, on green steel, my assumption is that the key technology underlying that assessment is electrolysis. A, is that correct? And B, could you elaborate a little bit more on some of the detail underpinning your assessment for green steel and why it seems to be less of a risk across quite a few of the factors than solar. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So in terms of the dominance of China in the supply chains, I think you mentioned Latin America, which usually comes up in the battery context, less on the solar panel context, because you have lithium mines, for example, in Bolivia, that could potentially be refined locally. In the solar panel context, we already see significant diversification outside of China. The problem for US policymakers is it's not into countries that, not into our country or other countries in North America, that's into Southeast Asia. And there's still Chinese MNCs, Chinese firms that are doing that. So the key supply chain disruption we identified here was not in the module, but it was in the upstream in the wafers, for example. So these Chinese firms will go to Southeast Asia where you can have low cost production and efficient production with reliable enough power supply to maintain those very energy intensive factories. In order to do that, they're importing now a lot of wafers from China. So I think that there is we find that the diversification strategy for a high risk supply chain disruption could be to shift some of those upstream components to different countries. But it falls short of requiring us to bring all of those things on shore, including the polysilicon production, wafer, cell module, all of those things. Batteries is a different story because China has established itself as a very crucial point in the refining supply chain. Now, refining is a very energy intensive and dirty process, and there's a reason why the US doesn't do a lot of refining anymore. It's also as a result, it's quite challenging to build up mining and refining companies here in this country and in other countries. And I think that's something that we will have to grapple with. And what is our appropriate diversification strategy given that? Mining is a little more challenging, right? Because the easy accessible minerals are in some places. And I don't think any country has done enough on ESG in the mining upstream sector. The second question was related to green steel, right? Okay, so we looked at 3 different technology pathways for green steel. We looked at EAF, we looked at hydrogen, H2, and we looked at direct reduced iron from methane. Our analysis was based on the fact that EAF, electric arc furnace, which relies on scrap steel and uses entirely electricity, does not require any direct coal inputs, is going to be a very important technology. And the US is already a leader in EAF. And China instead has really doubled down on blast furnace basic oxygen, right? So that's the traditional integrated steel manufacturing process. So a result of that integration with China would not seem to have a big impact on the US capabilities and diversified in the electric arc furnace. Secondarily, we also look at the US-EU Green Steel deal, where the two parties agreed to, over time, establish some kind of carbon content carbon trade barrier, essentially a CBA, on steel associated with the carbon content of it. And this would essentially allow any economic group to establish a green steel process that they might want. And if they meet those certain thresholds, then they can import into these different countries at without any penalties. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah.
And my question is regarding the political feasibility and political challenges of your policy recommendations. So you mentioned in your policy recommendations, you mentioned about like coexistence, trying to minimize material harm of tariffs. So what do you think are the political challenges to implement your policy recommendations? And what do you expect are the responses from White House or Congress when receiving such policy recommendations? Thank you.
Easy question. Yeah. So I think, and it's been widely reported, that there is supposedly a China consensus in Washington that we can't agree on what the problems are, what the solutions are, but we do agree that China is the problem and getting away from China is the solution, right? And I think this is largely evident in our trade policy as well. I think that minimizing the harm of these tariffs is absolutely critical. And just as one example, in May, if folks recall, there was this absolute catastrophe in the making where the Commerce Department was considering putting on up to 200% tariffs on imported solar panels, not but from China, but from Southeast Asia, our predominant importer countries, in response to a trade complaint. This basically ground the domestic solar industry to a halt, because not only would they face tariffs if they were put in place, they would also be retroactive tariffs. So if you purchased a solar panel and then 6 months later, the Commerce Department said, oh, wait, no, those firms were violating trade laws, you'd have to go back and pay 200% premium on that. No installer is going to take on that risk, and no other party wanted to take on that risk. And as a result of that, the Solar Energy Industry Association claimed that there were 100,000 solar jobs at risk if those tariffs went into place. Now, that's the industry association, so take it with a grain of salt. Those kinds of approaches where you have very potentially catastrophic large changes to costs of inputs can have huge impacts on project development installation, which is exactly what we need to be accelerating right now. So I think that's one lesson, and the administration responded to that by saying, okay, we're going to put a 2-year delay on any tariffs that we're going to put in place. And then we're also going to invoke the Defense Production Act to try to throw in some more money for domestic manufacturing of solar panels. That's a stopgap Band-Aid measure, right? 2 years is not enough time to domestically onshore the solar supply chain in the US, right? So I think these are the kinds of concerns that policymakers need to think about, and they are thinking about it, right? You do see some changes in administration policy as a result of these really glaring potential problems coming down the pike. Yeah. Good. Oh, sorry, her and then you.
Yeah, thank you. This is kind of following up, I think, a bit on this point, because it was really interesting to hear the presentation. And I guess my background's a little bit more on global cooperation and collaboration around these issues. So as I'm hearing the presentation and thinking about how, how is the US thinking about this, and what is the signal to other countries around the world in terms of how we're tackling a global clean energy transition. And so, yeah, just hearing some components around domestic jobs and fair competition, or is it, the risk of critical infrastructure? Is it, trading with like-minded countries or democracies? I felt a bit confused at the, how I'm seeing politics kind of come into this conversation and how you kind of address this issue in an effective way. So just thinking about our roles and how we can, try to focus the conversation on what are the criteria that we should actually, base this decision on. Yeah, I would be curious to get your perspective on which of these factors should be the ones that kind of come into our decision making, and how do we steer the conversation perhaps into more long-term thinking instead of perhaps what the China consensus is today in 2022.
Mm-hmm. So the purpose of these analyses and other ones similar to it are trying to create a more objective assessment of what are the risks of integrating with China, and to weigh those against the prospective benefits of integrating with China. And so that's why we went through this exercise of looking at economic risk, national security risks, going to technology and component level. And this could provide a blueprint for policymakers in terms of the policy recourse strategies that we identified of where it might be necessary to diversify, where we might be happy with having open supply chains and open R&D relationships, or where in extreme case we might need to have onshore industry or onshore RD&D for national security reasons. Our assessment of the risks, again, showed that national security risks were more muted. Some economic risks merit further consideration in terms of diversification, but not across all technologies. And in particular, in emerging technologies, there doesn't seem to be any really strong risk to try to force onshore in those areas. So those are the kind of key framework that we're laying out for policymakers based on this work. She's got the mic. Hey.
Thank you so much. It's super interesting. In the second paper you talked about, you ran from global markets to national markets, but the likely end state is probably somewhere in the middle with a kind of regional market, right? So if you run your lambda up to like 0.7 or 0.8 or whatever a regional market in your definition works, what does that mean for the cost and the cumulative cost of the transition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have those in the figure here. You know, we gave a 10-year period. Now, of course, some policymakers want to do it in 2 years, right? So 10 years was already beyond what some policymakers are calling for. But yeah, you can change around your lambda and try some different approaches. We actually post all of the sensitivity scenarios. I think I have a link up here somewhere. Oh yeah, where is it? There it is. Sorry, it's down here very low. You can actually explore the sensitivities for all of our work at this portal interactively. You can modify all of those parameters and play around with it and get your own cumulative savings, and then tweet me about it. Yeah. Oh yeah, go ahead. Right here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. My name is Sama Kuba. I'm a junior at the undergraduate level here at Harvard. I wanted to actually ask you a little bit about like the feasibility of like some of the policy implications you were talking about. I know you were kind of looking at like how like diversifying supply chains is kind of the way to go, and you pulled up the quote from believe it was Foreign Affairs advocating for competition. And I was curious to hear from you as to like how you feel about like American competitiveness and whether like an open and competitive environment that stresses like diversified supply chains, whether that's even really feasible for like America and its like democratic allies. In essence, like even given the space to be competitive, is America and its allies competitive compared to China?
Yeah, when we looked at the technologies those three mature technologies, we found in particular in wind turbines that US firms and other firms make very strategic international sourcing arrangements. And then US firms are more competitive because they have international suppliers, right? They can rely on certain components that are lower cost and they specialize in other components. And so in that case, China does not represent a high risk of supply chain diversification on our categorization. And at the same time, we see some very competitive international firms. So that is a model, right, where you have different types of specializations facilitated by free flow of goods and trade, et cetera. I think that's something to consider for prospective clean tech sectors. The other thing that we'll note is that it's going to be very hard to claw back competitiveness in an industry that's already established a very dominant preferred technology, and supply chain sourcing arrangements are so low cost as they are now in solar that it's not quite feasible to try to onshore that entirely. Diversification strategies where we try to have multiple countries sourcing in each of those components is a more viable approach to that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. So I'd like to hear your thoughts that one of the key
Yeah, I think the recycling component to this is important. We do recycle quite a bit of these very high cost, difficult to extract rare earth minerals already. And so what we're talking about is deploying new batteries, right? All of the minerals need to go in to deploy batteries that don't exist today, not ones that we're swapping out from previous ones. So that requires new minerals being dug out of the ground. And then I think you have to focus on the two critical components of that. One is the mining. Where is the mineral located in a low cost, easily accessible location? And that's very geographically specific, and can be associated with other problems like resource curses. And the second is refining, which could theoretically be located anywhere. China has, through a lot of industrial policy, established itself as a critical link in those rare earth mineral and other mineral refining capacity. So I think recycling is very important. We're not quite at the stage where we can really achieve all of our minerals requirements through recycling alone, but we need to continue to do that to reduce our dependence on virgin minerals. But we have to think more carefully about the upstream minerals and all the ESG components of that, as well as what are some strategies for enhancing, diversifying refining capacity, which is a lot more difficult. Yeah. One more here. Hi. No, it's a great question. In our analysis, we weren't able to estimate that because of this price elasticity problem, right? So if we assume that we're going to deploy clean tech to meet our policy objectives, no matter how expensive it is, then of course emissions aren't going to be affected by these costs. It's very difficult to estimate what that elasticity is. I mean, we tried. It's quite difficult. I think it's quite obvious to note that if it becomes a lot more expensive to deploy clean tech, we're probably going to have less ambitious policy targets, right? Right now, we have a administration level policy target for 2030. We've codified in a national determined contribution to the Paris Agreement. And now we have a lot of subsidies to help us get there, right? Now, we're hoping that those subsidies are enough to get us there. And that's still not enough to get us on the 1.52 degree track, but we're hoping that then we're going to have more ambitious legislation that would come in place, more policies that would be provided to do that. And if clean tech becomes a lot more expensive, it seems to us much less likely that that's going to be possible, strengthening. You mean like emissions intensity of the manufacturing of it? Of course, there's going to be some differences in the life cycle assessment way, right, of analyzing. But even when we look at production in China, where it's very coal heavy, the energy payback period for solar panels is very low. So once you produce the solar panels and you implement them after a few years, you've gotten back your energy benefits and the CO2 intensity. And China's also cleaning up its grid. So there's a more nuanced answer to that, and I'm not an LCA person. I think long term, that's not the key issue here, right? The key issue is how do we develop these low carbon technologies and deploy them? They have to be efficient and they have to last a long time in order to get back those carbon benefits. But how do we deploy those at scale? Yeah. We have a question over here. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you say agreement, do you mean free trade agreements or you just mean trade agreements? Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think there's quite a bit there. Well, currently there's no border carbon adjustment tariff, right? It's just discussed, right? That the US and EU, for example, are going to implement that on green steel. et cetera. I think there's some serious issues with designing a border carbon adjustment tariff. We discussed that in our trade report, where we look at some of the implications of putting in place a border carbon adjustment tariff. In terms of the multinational roles, I think a similar type of policy paradigm will be cropping up in mineral extraction countries that we have around manufacturing in this country. But with the added problem that you do have this very, very salient risk of developing a resource curse when you have very strong, highly concentrated, valuable minerals in a country with weak institutions that have potential for very centralized actors to accumulate the rents and then to propagate that through the political institutions. I think that's something very serious that we need to address, given the locations of where minerals are currently located. I think that, and this is what I advocate for here, is that we need to minimize the role of tariffs and quotas and other trade restrictions on our ability to deploy and develop clean technologies. I think that's imperative for a climate perspective. And I think there are reasons why we should be thinking about that in a trade context, right? So establishing rules that would facilitate that. I will just note, I'm not a trade lawyer. You have to preface everything, but hopefully some of your later talks in the seminar will get into the question of whether the IRA is actually WTO compliant. I think that's an interesting question to raise. And if it's not, is there something else we need to change about international trade norms to facilitate the low carbon transition? I'm not a trade lawyer. This is, oh, okay, great, okay.
Although one advice I got from the government is that what's legal under trade law is a function of health. So, but it's related to this, but I'm going to
Sure, yeah.
I want to drill down a little bit on what it means to diversify supply chains. So first, what should be our objective to diversify? Sounds like we need to, in a number of these technologies, diversify more. But how do I think about, and I'm not even sure when I say more, that makes it sound like it's only in one section. How would we think about the objective when we know we're actually making progress? We think about sort of the right way to, how far should we go, in which dimensions? What is sort of a sufficiently diversified supply chain? Second, talked about this as an important sort of policy recourse strategy of diversifying. What are some of the levers the federal government is actually pull to diversify? Talk a little bit about demand side subsidies, say in the Inflation Reduction Act, batteries. You could think about the use of trade policy. But I'm curious to hear sort of what do you think are sort of the right, what's the potential suite of tools we could draw from? What do you think holds the most promise for getting us towards what you think is sort of the right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on supply chains, I'll just go back to our definition here. So we're thinking about what's the potential vulnerability. So from a risk perspective, you're looking at probability times impact. So what's the vulnerability of a supply chain disruption as a result of natural disasters or government intervention? So natural disasters, you might think about the Fukushima earthquake and what the effect that it had on automotive production. And we can use that as a potential guide for how quickly firms could reallocate sourcing decisions. It turns out that it actually wasn't a huge impact, but long term. Or government intervention, such as China threatening a rare earth embargo to Japan back in 2010. So because of the potential, because of the high concentration of China in key components of solar and batteries, a diversification strategy makes sense. Not just because China is an authoritarian country the US government doesn't like, but because you have 80–90% of this thing being manufactured in one country and in a subset of regions in those countries that could have various disruptions associated with them. So I think that's more an objective and sort of agnostic way of thinking about what's the potential risk. Now, what's the threshold is another important question. And we don't attempt to come up with what's the right number, right? 80, 90% seems to be too high, right? But maybe less than 50% is enough. It depends on the ability, again, for firms to be able to reallocate production in the case of a dramatic disruption. So in the case of minerals refining, it takes quite a bit of time to build up refining capacity. So maybe we want to think about that a little more carefully. Solar manufacturing takes less time to build up, right? So we may want to think about that time frame over which firms would have to reallocate, plus that threshold. But we don't try to come up with that number. We're instead providing a framework that policymakers could use to think about, okay, if it's too diverse, if it's too concentrated, what should we try to do in response? Now, I think you make a very good point about diversification. I think we could certainly diversify by subsidizing manufacturing at home, not to the extent of eclipsing and becoming our sole supplier, right? Which is the objective currently of much of the trade policy. But we could manufacture and supply 25%, right, of our own in different components. And we have, a leading firm in the U.S. In thin film for solar that can provide a good fraction of solar modules that would diversify not only across geography but also technology. And they're doing great right now because of all of these policies. I think if we're looking at other countries, there are different methods that we could consider. So for example, the IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation, I think I got that right, has subsidized manufacturing in India of solar panels. International Development Corporation has subsidized solar PV plants in India to create a diversification from China. I think that may not turn out so well. It's kind of too early to tell. But there are levers like that where we could think about not trying to completely replace China, but to try to push for some other suppliers in the mix, right? And I think when we make that as a goal, you might find that there are more areas of convergence than you would think. And I'd also extend this to the notion that the geographic location seems to be more critical. The US policymakers tend to associate Chinese firms operating with Southeast Asia as equivalent to Chinese firms operating in the mainland and operating elsewhere. From a supply chain disruption perspective, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now, unless you think the Chinese government is going to restrict exports of solar panels and then require all of its firms, some of which are privately listed, to also restrict exports coming from other third countries, that risk seems quite low to me. And so I think if we think about it from that perspective, having a large amount of module manufacturing in Southeast Asia and potentially encouraging those countries, working with those countries to establish more upstream supplies of wafers, for example, could be a legitimate US policy recourse. It doesn't bring domestic manufacturing jobs back to the US in those areas, but it does address that diversification challenge. Yeah.
Given the time, I want to go ahead and wrap up.
Yeah.
I think Davidson may have some time for any other questions if you want to walk up. We'll go ahead and wrap up now. But before a final comment, let me note that next week we are off. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks' time. Carolyn Kuski of the Environmental Defense Fund will speak on the issue of climate change, natural disasters, and insurance. So please join us then 2 weeks from today. And finally, please join me in thanking Professor Davidson for his talk today. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, everyone.